How's it going, everyone? Recent data suggests that the Canadian NDP party is losing a lot of support. That's the left-wing party, which is farther left-wing than Justin Trudeau's Liberals. We're going to look at this data and see where is this lost support going, and is this a permanent trend? Could the NDP just be falling apart, or might they gain back some of those lost supporters? In front of us here, we have a chart from 338canada.com. This website looks at many different polls, and in this chart, we're looking over the past year and what percent of the population supports which party. Now, when we look at the NDP, for the past year, they've been bouncing around the high teens, and right around the time Justin Trudeau said that he will resign after a new Liberal Party leader is selected and that he will not be running again for Prime Minister, right around that time we see a drop in NDP support from the high teens to the low teens. Now, what else happened right at this turning point? Well, before that, for the past year, the Liberals have been bouncing around 25% support and gradually dropping actually from just above 25 to just below 25. But once Trudeau said he's resigning, the Liberals jumped up in support up to the low 30s. Meanwhile, what was going on with the Conservatives? Well, the Conservatives were bouncing around the low 40s. And around the time Trudeau said he'll be resigning, the Conservatives dropped from low 40s to high 30s. Now, the question is, well, this rise in Liberal support, is it mostly coming from the Conservatives or from the NDP? Well, looks like it's mostly coming from the NDP, because the Conservatives, yeah, it's a bit of a drop from low 40s to high 30s. But over the past year, they've dipped into those high 30s before. So the Conservatives aren't too far away from their typical behavior over the past year. Meanwhile, the NDP has dropped to a new low, just as the Liberals have risen to a new high. So it looks like that NDP support is going to the Liberals, and most of that Liberal rise in support is coming from the NDP. Now, we see even more specific data when we look at results of a recent Abacus poll. Okay, now here we don't have many different pollsters. Here we just have Abacus data. And we see the same trend here, except it looks even more obvious, right? So the Conservatives, since this is actually from November 2023, we see the Conservatives are just bouncing around the same amount, like low 40s, high 30s, mostly low 40s. And it looks like they actually haven't really dropped significantly either recently if we look at the Abacus data. Right? So the Conservatives are bouncing around the same level of support, low 40s. The Liberals have been bouncing around the low 20s, except recently, starting in January, they rose up to the high 20s. They started their rise right around the time Trudeau said he's resigning. And the NDP were bouncing around the high teens, and around the time Trudeau said he's resigning, they drop down to the mid-teens, right? So this chart makes it look even more obvious that NDP support dropped just as Liberal support increased. So NDP is losing support to the Liberals just around the time Trudeau said he's resigning. So it looks like you had left-wing voters who really didn't like Trudeau, so they were supporting the NDP. Trudeau said he's going to be stepping down. These voters switched from NDP to Liberals, and you have an increase in Liberal popularity with a drop in NDP popularity. Now, this Abacus poll has some other interesting data. If we scroll down to, let me find it, this chart right here, who people intend to vote for, arranged by which party they voted for in the previous federal election in 2021. Okay, so this column here that says Conservative, that's people who voted Conservative last federal election. Who do they plan on voting for this time? This column here that says Liberal, that's people who voted Liberal last election. Who do they plan on voting for this time? Then we have a column for NDP supporters from last election. Who do they plan on voting for now? And people who did not vote last election. Who do they plan on voting for now? And we see some interesting information here. So when it comes to the Conservatives, nothing surprising. 85% of those who voted Conservative last time plan on voting Conservative this time. No surprise there. 4% are voting Liberal, right? 2% NDP, 1% Green, 1% Bloc Québécois, 7% undecided, right? So you have these small percentages that are going to other parties, 85% sticking with who they voted for. Again, no surprise. Okay? Liberal voters, right? 66% of people who voted Liberal last time plan on voting Liberal again this time. It's a majority. It's a clear majority, but not as big as 85. Again, that's not a surprise. As we see here, right, Conservatives are more popular than Liberals. Maybe like some very, very recent polls show Liberals a little bit ahead, but not too much ahead, right? The Abacus data still shows Conservatives significantly ahead of the Liberals, right? So, yeah, 66%, no surprise there. Where did people leave the Liberals to? Mostly the Conservatives, 15%. Again, no surprise. We knew that, right? Over the last 9 years or so, Liberals have been losing support to the Conservatives. Nothing surprising, right? Only 7% went to the NDP. Okay, so from Liberal supporters, most people shifted to these are probably center-left people who switched over to the center-right rather than moving farther left. No surprise there. Now we get to the NDP. Of people who voted NDP last election, what percent of them still plan on voting NDP? 56%. 56%, okay? Which is about 50%, okay? That's about half. So that means 44%, again, about half, 44% of people who supported NDP last election no longer want to support them this election. That's huge, okay? If approximately half of your former supporters no longer want to support you, that is bad news for the party, okay? Very, very big sign right here. Now the question is, where are these former NDP supporters going? And the interesting thing is, mostly they're not going to the Liberals, okay? The biggest category of where they're going, other than NDP, is right here. 16% of those who voted NDP last time are now voting Conservative, okay? 10% are voting Liberal. 16% are voting Conservative. All right. You got 3% Green, 12% undecided. So about half of former NDP supporters are no longer supporting NDP. And where are they going? The largest portion of them is going to the Conservatives, right? So they're not even going from one left-wing party to the other left-wing party, the Liberals, which is what we saw in the previous data we looked at just now, which is about the recent shift in NDP supporters just since January. No, they're mostly going towards the Conservatives, right? So who are these people who are shifting from one left-wing party, not to the other left-wing party, but to the right-wing party, to the Conservatives? Well, it could be they're people who just became disillusioned with the left wing, switched their views, went from left wing to right wing. That happens. Or it could be people who never really had left wing views to begin with. Maybe they just had more anti-establishment views. And before, the socialist version of anti-establishment ideas appeal to them. And now the libertarian version of anti-establishment ideas appeal to them more. So they switch from NDP to Conservatives, right? Could be either one, right? Now, let's look at those who did not vote in the last federal election, okay? Those who did not vote, 34% of them are undecided, all right? That's, the gray there is undecided, in case you didn't see that, right? Okay, that's not surprising, right? They didn't vote last time. 34%, one-third of them is not sure who to vote for this time. Makes sense. But other than that, largest group is Conservatives, right? So people voting who didn't vote last time, 1/4 of them voting for Conservatives. Who's second most popular? The Liberals with 16%, and only 9% of them is voting NDP. All right. So this long-term trend, right, or data that looks at the long term, it's not really a trend, just data that looks at what's changed since 2021, shows NDP voters leaving and going all over the place, but mostly to the Conservatives, right? Whereas the short-term trends that we looked at before, since just January this year, shows NDP voters leaving and going towards the Liberals, right? So, but either way, whether you look at long-term or short-term, NDP supporters are ditching the party, right? Now, this is all theoretical, right? These are all polls that look at a sample population, which they hope is representative of the general population, but might not be. So theory is all interesting, but what about practical results? Well, we actually have some practical results because Ontario, which is 40% of Canada's population, just had an election. And provincial elections are different than federal elections, right? People might support one party provincially and another party federally, but it's still valuable data. So let's look at that. All right. This is the provincial Ontario results from the election that just happened at the end of February. The NDP lost seats. They went from 31 seats to 27 seats. So they lost 4 seats. Where did those seats go? Well, 2 of those seats went to the Conservatives, 1 went to the Greens, 1 went to the Liberals. That's exactly what we see in this data here, right? The NDP has lost support, substantial amount of support, okay? 44% of previous NDP supporters don't plan on voting for them. Who do they plan on voting for? Well, the largest group is the Conservatives. 16% of former NDP voters plan on voting Conservative. And then after that, you got Liberals with 10%, Greens with 3%. All right, so this abacus data matches what we see in the Ontario election results, where NDP is losing support, mostly to the Conservatives, but also to Greens and Liberals. Okay, people are ditching the party, going all over the place. Now look at this other data from Ontario. Okay, total change in vote share since last election. Liberals gained support from 24% to 30%. Conservatives gained support from 41% to 43%. NDP lost a lot of support from 23.7% of the vote to 18.6%. That is a big drop. Okay, now look at these charts here. Okay, so this is looking at the different electoral districts in Ontario and how the percent of the popular vote changed in the different electoral districts. So the red here is Liberals, the blue here is Conservatives, the up arrow means support increased. Okay, pretty much everywhere support increased for both Liberals and Conservatives. All right, now if we scroll down here, we see the NDP in orange and the Greens in green. Pretty much everywhere the arrows are pointing down for the NDP. For the Greens, I mean, there's not much change, but you see this big upward arrow for Kitchener Centre, where the Greens gained more than 38 percentage points of the vote, and the NDP lost more than 33%. Big shift from the NDP to the Greens, right? So everybody's got these very noticeable up arrows, okay? Greens, Liberals, Conservatives. NDP has down arrows all over the place, okay? Voters are ditching the NDP for pretty much anyone else. Okay, so we see that as experimental results, you could call it observational results from Ontario's provincial election, which support this theory that that the NDP is losing support all over the place. All right, now let's look at a news headline from today. This is from the National Post, okay? With NDP staring down electoral collapse, Singh, that's the head of the NDP, walks back pledge to defeat Liberals. Polls show NDP lurching towards worst ever performance in general election, okay? Let's scroll down here. There we go. Okay, so I'll just show you the beginning of this article. With the NDP staring down some of the worst poll numbers in history, leader Jagmeet Singh is suddenly walking back his pledge to bring down the Liberal government at the earliest opportunity. So currently, the Liberal government has a minority of parliament, which means to stay in power, they need some other party to support them. That other party has been the NDP, because if you take NDP seats plus Liberal seats, then you get a majority. So, following Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's prorogation of Parliament on January 6th, Singh repeatedly promised that as soon as the House of Commons convenes on March 24th, his first action would be to trigger an election with a vote of non-confidence, meaning he will stop supporting the Liberals, which means there has to be an election. Quote, "I've been really clear and I remain clear and I appreciate the opportunity to repeat it. We will be voting to bring down the government at the earliest opportunity." Okay, that was said on January 20th. Okay, Singh was even more explicit at a public appearance in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, where he said, quote, "We will be voting against the government when we return to Parliament at the end of March, and there will be an election in the spring," end quote. But then the NDP leader was reminded of that pledge at a Parliament Hill press availability this week. He replied that an election can wait. Quote, "We're literally in a trade war, and I can't imagine any opposition leader that would want to support a package to help workers impacted by... I can't imagine any opposition leader that wouldn't want to support a package to help workers impacted by this. Quote, we need supports for workers first and an election afterwards." Okay, so no longer the first thing being bringing down the government and calling a new election. No, first thing, support for workers and an election afterwards. How far afterwards? Who knows? Okay, now, could this be because of the trade war, or could it be because of the bad polling numbers? Who knows? Okay, but once Parliament is back in session, that's after the Liberals select a new leader. Okay, we actually even have that date here, new Liberal Party leader to be selected, right? Like within a week. Now, once that new Liberal Party has been selected, if Trudeau steps down immediately and that new Liberal Party leader becomes the Prime Minister, Canada finds itself in an unusual situation because the Prime Minister will have been someone who was never elected in a general election. That's an awkward place for a democratic country to be in. Okay? So people are expecting that an election would be called as soon as possible. And of course, that Liberal leader could call an election if they want. But if they don't call an election and the NDP doesn't end support for the Liberals to cause an election, then Canada's in this weird situation where the Prime Minister was never actually elected by the people. And the longer that goes on, the more uneasy people might feel with that Liberal government, the more support Liberals could start losing. And this jump in Liberal popularity could start to drop more and more. Now, where will that Liberal support be going? Well, first we ask, which Liberals will it be that will drop support for the party first? Well, probably the ones who recently started supporting the party, because they're less committed. They've been supporters for a shorter period of time. Okay, so these recently added supporters of the Liberals, where did they come from? From the NDP. So where is their support going to go once they decide to no longer support the Liberals anymore? Well, quite likely they'll go back to the NDP, right? So the longer that Liberal government stays in power, quite possibly the more of those votes or supporters the NDP will gain back. And maybe that's also being taken into consideration here with an NDP strategy to delay elections. Or who knows, maybe it's just about the trade war. We'll have to wait and see. But I thought that all was pretty interesting analysis. So I hope you enjoyed that, and until next time.